The question everyone inside the league is asking is this: why would a team with the second worst record in the NBA refuse to trade anyone? On Friday, NBA insider Chris Haynes reported that the New Orleans Pelicans are informing other teams that Zion Williamson will remain with the organization through the trade deadline. In addition to Williamson, the Pelicans are also saying they'll hold on to Trey Murphy, Herb Jones, Derik Queen, and Jeremiah Fears through February 5th. With few teams looking to sell, the Pelicans are, according to Haynes, disappointing the market by holding on to their talented stable of trade assets. The context makes New Orleans' stance even more puzzling. Heading into Friday's play, the Pelicans sat at 8 wins and 31 losses, the worst record in the Western Conference and second worst in the league. Making matters worse, New Orleans doesn't own their first-round pick this year, having traded it to the Hawks to move up in last June's draft to select Queen. Williamson, the 2019 number 1 overall pick, has been limited to just 23 games this season, with a hamstring injury and later an adductor strain, adding to the long list of injuries he sustained during his NBA career. He's played in just 237 regular season games since being drafted by New Orleans, nearly 8 years ago. For a franchise enduring a catastrophic season without the ability to benefit from high draft positioning, the decision to hold rather than sell raises fundamental questions about organizational philosophy and long-term strategy. And according to sources close to the situation, the internal debates that led to this public stance reveal an organization deeply divided about its future direction. People familiar with the matter say the Pelicans front office has been engaged in intense discussions for weeks about whether to pivot toward a complete rebuild or maintain their current roster core despite the disastrous season. According to those briefed on internal deliberations, there was significant pressure from multiple directions: ownership wanting to preserve the franchise's marketability, basketball operations evaluating pure asset value, and coaching staff considering developmental timelines. Sources say these competing priorities created genuine tension about the appropriate path forward. What hasn't been reported publicly, according to people close to the organization, is that New Orleans' decision to hold its players wasn't unanimous within the front office. Sources say there was a vocal faction arguing that an 8-31 record without control of the team's own draft pick represented exactly the scenario where selling high-value assets made strategic sense. People familiar with these arguments describe presentations showing how trading players like Williamson, Murphy, or Jones could accelerate a timeline toward sustained competitiveness by accumulating young talent and draft capital. Behind the scenes, according to those briefed on the situation, the counterargument centered on the belief that New Orleans' struggles this season were circumstantial rather than structural. Sources say this group within the organization pointed to the extraordinary injury situation, particularly Williamson's limited availability, as the primary cause of the team's poor record. People familiar with this perspective describe it as maintaining that the core talent remained strong enough to compete once health returned, and that selling now would mean giving up on players whose value was artificially depressed by temporary circumstances. The Williamson situation specifically, according to people close to the organization, became the focal point of these internal debates. Sources say some within the front office questioned whether his pattern of limited availability, 237 games across nearly 8 years represented a fundamental concern about long-term durability and whether the organization should move him while other teams might still view him as a cornerstone talent. People familiar with these discussions describe them as data-driven evaluations of availability patterns rather than speculation about specific medical conditions. But another faction within the Pelicans organization, according to those briefed on the debates, argued forcefully that trading Williamson during a down season would represent selling at the absolute lowest point of his value curve. Sources say this group maintained that Williamson's talent, when healthy, remained elite, that his 23 games this season provided too small a sample size for evaluation, and that patience would allow his value to recover once he returned to sustained availability. People familiar with these arguments describe them as emphasizing the risk of regret, that trading Williamson now and watching him thrive elsewhere would haunt the franchise for years. What made the decision particularly complex, according to sources close to the situation, was the absence of the Pelicans' own first-round pick. People familiar with internal discussions say this created a unique strategic consideration, that bottoming out completely this season wouldn't even produce the typical compensation of high draft positioning. Sources describe this as forcing the front office to think differently about the value of maintaining current assets versus the traditional rebuild calculus. Behind the scenes, according to those briefed on the matter, the trade calls from other teams reportedly intensified as New Orleans' record deteriorated. Sources say multiple franchises reached out expressing interest in various Pelicans players, with some offering packages centered around draft picks and young players. People familiar with these preliminary conversations describe them as other teams sensing opportunity, recognizing that New Orleans' terrible season might create motivation to sell. What surprised people within the Pelicans organization, according to sources, was the quality of interest in their players despite the team's record. Multiple teams reportedly expressed genuine willingness to construct significant packages for players like Herb Jones or Trey Murphy. People briefed on these discussions say the offers being floated demonstrated that other organizations viewed New Orleans' struggles as circumstantial and still valued the individual talent on the roster. According to those close to the situation, the front office's ultimate decision to inform teams that their core players would remain available was reached after extensive debate, extending right up until Haynes' report went public. Sources say there were final meetings where both sides of the internal divide made their cases, with leadership ultimately deciding that preserving the current core aligned better with the organization's long-term vision than immediate asset conversion. The specific players New Orleans committed to keeping, Williamson, Murphy, Jones, Queen, and Fears, reportedly reflected a generational and timeline consideration. Sources say the front office viewed these players as spanning different developmental stages, but all fitting within a similar competitive window, if the team could achieve health and stability. People familiar with this thinking describe it as betting on talent and age over immediate draft capital accumulation. What hasn't been discussed publicly, according to people close to the organization, is how the coaching staff processed this decision. Sources say the coaches understood that maintaining the current roster meant they'd be expected to show significant improvement once health returned. that the patience being extended to the players would also apply to coaching performance evaluation. People familiar with coaching staff discussions describe a mixture of relief at not losing key players mid-season and pressure to demonstrate that the talent level, when available, could produce competitive basketball. The reaction from rival teams, according to sources familiar with league-wide discussions, ranged from frustration to strategic recalibration. People briefed on these conversations say several front offices that had been preparing offers for Pelicans players were forced to pivot to alternative targets. Sources describe this as New Orleans' stance, creating a ripple effect through the trade market. Teams that viewed the Pelicans as likely sellers now had to adjust their deadline strategies entirely. Behind the scenes, according to those close to the situation, there were reportedly discussions about whether New Orleans might soften its stance if the right offer materialized before the deadline. Sources say the front office left themselves theoretical flexibility, that the public messaging about keeping players didn't necessarily mean every conceivable offer would be rejected. People familiar with this thinking describe it as the organization maintaining leverage while keeping options open if an unexpectedly strong proposal emerged. What complicated the Pelicans' evaluation, according to those briefed on internal analysis, was the uncertainty about next season's outlook. Sources say the front office couldn't predict with confidence what kind of roster health and availability to expect, making it difficult to project whether the current core could actually compete or whether the same injury concerns would resurface. People familiar with these projections describe them as operating with significant uncertainty about fundamental variables. The ownership group's position, according to sources familiar with their thinking, reportedly emphasized maintaining fan engagement and franchise relevance over pure asset optimization. People briefed on ownership's perspective say there was concern that a complete teardown, trading Williamson and other recognizable players, would damage the franchise's connection with its market and make rebuilding even more difficult. Sources describe this as prioritizing long-term franchise health over short-term strategic purity. What remained uncertain, according to people close to the situation, was whether New Orleans had made the right call, or whether they'd look back on this deadline as a missed opportunity to reset the franchise trajectory. Sources say, even within the front office, there was acknowledgement that reasonable people could disagree about the optimal path forward, that the decision involved genuine strategic trade-offs, rather than an obvious correct answer. League-wide, according to sources familiar with broader NBA discussions, the Pelicans' stance became a case study in organizational philosophy during losing seasons. People briefed on conversations among rival executives say several teams debated whether New Orleans' approach represented patient, long-term thinking or stubborn denial of reality. The precedent being set, sources say, could influence how other franchises in similar situations approach their own deadline decisions. If you found this breakdown insightful, take a moment to like the video. It helps this story reach more basketball fans who care about what happens beyond the box score. For more NBA stories inspired by real news, told with depth, context, and realism, subscribe to Beyond the Hardwood. And if you want to be here when the next chapter unfolds, Turn on notifications so you don't miss our next investigation. Let us know what you think in the comments. Was this the right move? Or is there more beneath the surface? Until next time, this is Beyond the Hardwood.